Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for another Tuesday afternoon program here with the Genealogy Center. We're glad that you're here, and we are looking forward to today's program, which will focus on sharing the stories of your ancestors. So today's speaker is EvaAnne Johnson, and she is a genealogy and local history librarian in the Chicagoland area. And she's been researching her own family history since 1998. She earned a Master of Library and Information Science degree from the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign and a Bachelor of Arts from Illinois College. And she's a member of the Illinois State Historical Records Advisory Board and a consultant at the Wilmette FamilySearch Center. So we're glad to have her here today, and I will hand it over to her.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here. So thank you all for coming. I'm going to be talking today about sharing the stories of your ancestors. So today is meant to be an introduction to a lot of these topics. We're going to be sharing a lot of ideas that I won't have a whole lot of time to dig into the details for. So I've provided in your handout a lot of resources and books that can get you started on some of these ideas and some of these projects. So what we are going to be talking about today are some reasons why it's important to share family history, some elements of storytelling in order to make your stories interesting, and then ideas for sharing your family story using storytelling out loud, writing, using photos and video, using social media and other online resources. And then finally, we'll touch upon preserving your family stories. And we'll have a few final thoughts before getting to the Q&A. So first of all, why do we share family stories? So as I was preparing for the presentation today, this quote caught my eye, and this quote talks about family history as a perishable commodity, meaning that it disappears with time as memories fade, loved ones pass on. So it's really important to preserve a record of the present and the past for the future and pass them on because they're perishable. They can disappear at really any time. So one of our main motivations for sharing family stories is preservation, keeping those stories alive so they don't fade over time or don't get lost completely. And even if your family is not interested right now in those stories, we preserve them for some time in the future. So think about how wonderful it would be to find like the autobiography of your great-great-grandmother from 1820. It would be amazing. We would be so excited. So we want to be able to have those stories, have some kind of record of our stories for the future. One other reason could be for healing. Everyone's family has something painful in it. Everyone makes mistakes, or there's ups and downs, terrible things that happen within a family. And sometimes for some people, sharing those family stories can help move us toward healing from that and being better in the future. Another really big reason is to get others interested. This could be getting our family interested in the stories. We want people, especially our own family, to be interested in the past. And how are we going to be doing that? We'll talk about that in a little bit. One of the ways that we get people interested is building connections. So building connections is another reason why we can share family stories. So either that's connecting to living family members within our immediate family, maybe it's building connections with distant cousins, maybe it's building a connection with long lost cousins that we didn't know, building connections with people in our community where our family came from. So any kind of connection that we can build is a good reason to share family stories. And one On this topic, I do want to bring up an interesting concept that we should keep in mind when we're sharing family stories, and that is called the 200-year present. So this is a concept that was developed by Elise Boulding, and I heard about it on a radio program many years ago, and it really stuck in my mind. And we're going to do a little exercise to show you what this means. So first, think of yourself as a child. When you were young, who is the oldest person when you were a child that had an impact on your life? Okay, for me, that was my grandfather. And now think of the approximate year, if you can remember, what year was that person born? So for me, it was my grandfather. He was born about 1920. Okay, now think about your present right now. Who is the youngest person in your family that you have an impact on? So it's probably going to be a child in your family. Think of that child when they're 100 years old and estimate what year that's going to be. So for me, the kids in my family are going to be 100 years old after the year 2100. So that seems like a really far ways away, but the people that we are impacting now could be alive in the year 2100. Okay, and then think of the difference between those 2 years. So for me, that number is 180 years. This effect is even more striking the longer that you live. So for my grandmother, who lived to be 91 years old, her great-grandmother was alive and she remembers her great-grandmother. Her great-grandmother was born in 1837. Her great-grandchild, again, will be 100 years old after 2100. So her life spanned 260 years, if I'm doing it approximately right. So that means whatever number that is for you right now, that means that people have impacted your life from that time span, and you will have touched the lives of people going into the future for that many years. So your present reality spans probably about 200 years. So it's very interesting to think about how we want to make sure that the stories from 100 years before us are going to survive 100 years after us. So it seems like a lot of pressure, and I don't want to put extra pressure on you, but it's an interesting concept to think about. So first of all, what stories do I share? So if I'm going to be doing all that building bridges and everything, where do I start? So the best place to start, just like with genealogy, the best place to start is with yourself. As genealogists, we often forget to share our own stories about our own life. So start with those kind of stories. You know, what is important to you? How did you get started in family history? What are some of your hobbies? What do you love to do? What are some of your earliest childhood memories? So record those stories and start sharing those stories, because those are the stories that make up you. You can also start with stories that you know really well. So for me, I'm really close to my maternal grandparents and I knew them really well. And so I can easily share those stories because they're always in the front of my mind. Okay, so you could start with those kind of stories. When you're thinking of stories that you want to share, you can also think about making that connection between your living family members or whoever your audience is and the past. So if you're thinking about your family, what are some connections? What are some opportunities for connections that you can make? You know, is there a musical talent that runs in the family? Is there something in common that a living family member shares with an ancestor? Is there something that your living family members are really, really interested in? Maybe they are not interested in your ancestors from the 1850s and what they did, but they're really interested in their own grandparents and really want to connect with their grandparents who have now passed away and they want to remember them. So share those stories, make those connections. You can get inspired by all kinds of things. You can find stories in really anything that you have. You know, look through family photos, you know, look at family heirlooms, look into the story behind recipes, or look through old yearbooks. If we dig deep enough, there's probably going to be a story in almost anything. census records. You could come up with a story from a single census record. So what stories could be behind any of those things? And if you're still stuck, think of some broad topics that could interest you. Maybe you really love like Lord of the Rings and epic journeys like that. So look for epic journeys in your own family. Did someone make an epic journey from Germany all the way to the Midwest? Think of those kinds of things. Or maybe someone overcame a huge obstacle in their time, or had an interesting wartime experience. So those kinds of things can help us come up with a story. All right, and when we're thinking of which stories we want to tell, especially if we want to figure out where we want to start, think about what stories you already have in your family history and which of those stories are important to you. So for instance, when I was going through this process and wanted to start sharing family stories in a blog format, I was thinking, where do I want to start? And I asked myself, okay, if my cousins, or if people in my family only knew one story from my family, what do I want that one story to be? And for me, it's the story about my grandmother who joined the Waves during World War II, and her story of why she joined and what she did and friends she made and all of that. So that story was really important to me. And it was the first one that I shared on my blog. And I share it at any opportunity that I have whenever I'm talking about anything. So that story is important to me. I decide that I'm going to share that as often as I can. You also need to ask yourself, who's your audience? So sometimes you have an audience and you need to find stories that will interest them. So maybe your audience is your immediate family. You need to find stories that they will be interested in and they will be engaged in. Sometimes you have a really interesting story and you need to be able to find an audience where you can share that, where that audience is going to be interested and engaged with that story. So whichever one is the case, you need to know who your audience is and know what is going to be interested in them, and know the best way to reach them. So maybe if it's your immediate family, talking to them on the phone and telling stories that way, or via email is the easiest. But if you're trying to reach, other genealogists, that's not going to be feasible. You might need to think of other ways to share your story. So also how you are going to be sharing your method for sharing the stories will depend on who your audience is. And when you're thinking of different projects or different things that you can do, you want to think about, what is your goal? Is it to get your family interested in these stories? Is it to your primary goal is to preserve these stories for the future so someone else can come upon them? What do you want to get out of this project? And also, what is your scope? So if your audience is, specific cousins on one side of the family, you don't want to be sharing stories from the other side of the family. They aren't going to be interested. So sometimes you need to narrow down which stories you tell based on, your method or who your audience is. So it's just some things to keep in mind. All right, so for most stories, we're not going to know all the details about that story. Unless it happened to us and we remember every detail about it, we're probably not going to remember every detail. So we're going to need to do a little organization and do a little bit of research probably. So you want to look at, okay, what do you already know? What has been told to you? What do you already have in your head? And what records do you already have that support that story? So, if this was about my great-grandfather, Charles Drake, I have an article here about him. What has been told to me about him? What records do I have? I have his death certificate, I have an obituary, I have a few other things. Then you look at what you have and what can you infer from that? Is there any dots you can already connect? Is there already a story emerging from those records that you can start to put together? And then possibly you'll need to do a little bit of research if there's not a clear story that's already put together. So what else can you learn about the family? Look at newspaper articles, try to find more of those. Talk to relatives. Maybe they forgot about this story, but you bring it up with them and it triggers a memory for them. look for letters or diaries or anything else about your family that you can find that relates to this story and can give you more details for when you're telling the story. And also, our families didn't exist in a bubble all by themselves. They were part of a community. So you might want to dive into local history and learning about the community. So again, newspapers are great for this, or local history books, church histories, if they were part of an organization or a particular military unit. So learn about the people in the community around your family where this story was happening. And also about the time period. So this is where you will want to dig into something called social history a little bit. So social history is the history of everyday people. So you want to maybe learn, what kind of clothes were people wearing at that time? What kind of houses did they live in? What was their kitchen like? How did they cook and bake and bathe and do all those things? If they were a farmer, what kind of farm implements were they using? They obviously weren't using huge combines, modern combines like we have now. What were they using on their farm? So learn about the time period and what kinds of things they would have been doing and what their everyday lives would have been like. All right, so once we have those details, you'll want to try to put them together into cohesive stories. So we want to have a few elements of storytelling in mind when we're putting this story together. It makes the story engaging and interesting, and also keeps you from rambling on and on about random things that you know about your family. It keeps it cohesive. Okay, so every story has a narrator or a storyteller and an audience or a listener. Okay, so you're going to need to know the story really well, and you're going to need to be able to adapt that story for your audience, right? And choose stories for your audience that is going to engage them. Every story has characters, setting, plot, and theme. You're going to have each of these, whether you realize it or not, in your story, and you want to pay attention to them. Okay, so who are the characters in this story? What are they like? How do they relate to each other? What is their personality? What do they look like even? So give some of those details. What is the setting like? Where does this take place and when does it take place? Be sure to talk about that. Is it an overcrowded city at the turn of the century? Is it, the open prairie in the 1850s? Is it suburbia in 1950s? Like, all of that will matter to your story, and it'll be a different kind of story depending on what the setting is. The plot is the action, so what the characters are doing to move the story along. And finally, what is the theme? So, what is the audience going to take away from this story? And also note about the characters, make sure that, unless you're telling a story about yourself in your own life, you're not going to be the main character in this story. You want to make sure that your ancestors are the main characters in this story. So the story is not going to be that, you went to the library and you did all of this and you found this census record, and this is what you learned from that census record about this ancestor. That's, unless someone is also a very enthusiastic genealogist like yourself, they're probably not going to be interested in that story. They want to know what your ancestors were doing. What are they doing and why is it important? So just a note about that. All right, and every story has an introduction or a beginning, a climax, and a conclusion. So of course, the beginning is going to set the stage, introduce the characters, tell the listener where and when this is happening. The plot is going to move the story along until you reach a climax or a turning point. Something major happens, and then it gets quickly resolved in a conclusion. And by the conclusion, the audience is going to need to know, why is this story important? What was the point of this story, and what happened as a result of all of these details. And when we're using storytelling, we want to use engaging details and descriptive language, okay? So all those details that we just learned on the previous slide, all that research that we did, we want to include some of those details when we're telling a story so that our audience can really imagine the characters and what is happening in their own heads. We don't want to get bogged down on every single detail you know about their lives, but you want to have enough details that it's a vivid picture and very engaging. Okay, so you don't want to just say like, oh, I played outside as a kid and it was fun. Well, that doesn't give very much information. You want to say, you know, I woke up early at the crack of dawn on Saturday morning and I rushed through breakfast and I ate a piece of toast and then I went outside and it was kind of hot. So you see there's all kinds of other details that I can include in there. So when I'm writing a story, I always keep these things in mind. So here's a very, very quick example. Here's some information about my great-grandfather, Charles Drake. You know, things that could be on his family tree, on his profile, when he was born, his parents, when he was married, his occupation, and when he died. You know, some basic information about him. You know, I've gathered some things together, his death certificate, his obituary, some things like that. And I start to look at what I know about him from stories from my grandfather, and also the records that I have. Okay, and I can put together a very short story about him. I'm not going to get into all the specific details, but I could tell a story about him where the theme is resilience through trouble. So he had a whole bunch of ups and downs in his life. You know, his parents divorced when he was young. He started working when he was pretty young to help support his mother when they moved from the small town DeKalb to Chicago. You know, his father committed suicide also about that same time. He moved back home after his mother died. He got married. He had 2 sons. They lost their farm in the Great Depression. You know, all kinds of things happened, but with all these troublesome things happened, he always found a way to bounce back. So some of the stories that I tell about him are about his perseverance and resilience. When all of these horrible things happened, he always found a way through. He did die pretty young, but he passed along all of these great values to his sons, like that resilience, hard work, humor, those kinds of things. So that is a story that I could tell about him using a few tidbits that I know from my grandfather, but also finding the stories and connecting the dots from records that I have found and newspaper articles that I have found. Okay, and that's what makes his story interesting. If I just gave this information to my family, that's interesting. Okay, it's good to know. But if I tell a story about his life, all the things that have happened and how he overcame all those things, well, that's a lot more interesting to my family and to other people that I want to connect with, right? That's what makes his story interesting. All right, so before you get started on any of these ideas that I'm going to be sharing with you in a minute, there's probably a few things that you'll want to start with or do before you start. So first, gather those photos and documents that can help you tell the story. So, you know, I found that photo of my grandfather and I'm going to scan that. And, you know, if I write a story about him on my blog, I'm going to include that picture in there. You know, I'm going to gather up those newspaper articles and pair them alongside my story as well, because they'll help tell the story and help support the story. If it is a project that is a little more involved, you can recruit family members to help you. You know, maybe someone is interested in podcasts or those kinds of things. So if that's what you want to do and you want to connect with them on that level, recruit that family member to help you do storytelling through a podcast. You know, maybe you have a bunch of photos that you need help scanned or something like that, or maybe there's family members who know a different side of the story that can help you tell the story and have more details for your story. So recruit family members to help you if you can. Again, do that background research to give yourself more details, more bulk to your story, make it more interesting. Whenever you're thinking about a story, you might be real excited about doing this particular thing, but if it doesn't necessarily match your goal, your audience, or like the stories that you want to tell, it might not be an appropriate project for that. So, you know, try to match up your projects or how you're going to be sharing these stories to match your goal audience and the scope of what you're doing. And then I also encourage you to just get started with it. These ideas that I'm going to be sharing go from the most basic and the easiest and not a whole lot of planning to projects that will include a little bit more planning, but just get started. You know, now is the best time ever to get started on these. You know, don't wait until later. I'll bring that up again, I'm sure. All right, so now we're going to be talking about various ideas for how to share your family story. You know, we're going to talk about sharing it out loud, writing it down, photos and video, and using social media. With all of these, you're going to want to choose something that works for you. You know, if you are intimidated by writing a big book or writing in general, don't do that. Pick something else that, you know, plays to your strengths. Okay. And I will be also all of these are ideas. So I'll be sharing ideas. Occasionally I'll be mentioning some brands. This is not necessarily an endorsement of those services necessarily, but it's just an idea of something that's out there. Okay. So let's get started. So first, some ideas for sharing your family history orally or out loud. So the easiest way to get started in this is to just bring up family stories in everyday conversations, right? So when you're around the dinner table or at family gatherings, just tell a quick, like 1 or 2 minute story. You don't have to prepare a 20-minute presentation for family Christmas, but you know, when you're making those special dishes, say, oh, did you know that this recipe came from Aunt Sally, and Aunt Sally, you know, da 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 da, and just share a quick story and bring it up in everyday conversation. So it's something that can be talked about in your family. And that might not always be easiest to do. So another option is recording stories using a recording device or an app or something like that. Most phones now have a voice recorder in them, so you can just open that up and start talking, start sharing a story. There's also services out there that'll transcribe what you say from a audio file and transcribe it, and then you can edit it and clean it up a little bit. Ancestry has something new called Storymaker Studio that you can use through the app to record audio stories, or there's something called StoryCorps. That StoryCorps is really for interviewing someone else. So if there's someone else who you want to interview and swap family stories, that could be a way to do it. With this suggestion, I really suggest looking at oral history interview questions and interview yourself. So look at those kinds of questions and record yourself answering those questions. So those questions are really good for getting ideas of what to talk about. And there's also some other fun options. So you could make a podcast. So podcasts are really hot, and there's podcasts about every single topic. You could start a podcast that you distribute just to your own family. And there's all kinds of different ways to put that together and some resources online for putting that together, but it could be an interesting thing. There's also live storytelling events that are around in some communities, so seek those out, see if there's anything, and then you can go and present a story from your family, and there'll be other storytellers there, and you'll be able to learn from their stories, and they will be interested in your stories as well. There's also, along those same lines, there's discussion groups in some communities. So you could look for a genealogy discussion group or a genealogy club where you'll go and you'll meet with other genealogists or family historians and just swap stories. And so maybe no one in your immediate family will be interested, or maybe they're too far away to meet with on a regular basis. But you can go and meet with other people who are really excited about sharing stories and swap stories that way. So a lot of suggestions for sharing your family stories have to do with writing your family history, and there's a lot of resources out there. And so I'm going to be talking about some of the options. So again, the easiest way to get started is to get a blank journal or a blank notebook and just start writing down some of your memories, right? You know, once a week, I'm going to spend 15 minutes and I'm going to just write it down. It's not going to be perfect. There's going to be spelling mistakes. It's not going to be terribly cohesive, but I'm just going to get it down on paper, right? You know, again, you could use those questions from oral history interviews, or there's pre-formatted journals. Like if you search for family history keepsake journal or family tree memory keeper, they have questions in there and you just fill it in. That can be a great way to get started and just get something down on paper. All right, and once you start writing those, once you start going, it can be a little bit easier. Once you start it, it's easier to keep going. So once you have some things in your journal and you have some ideas, you can put those together and do something with it. So one of the options, if you have an online family tree, like on Ancestry or something, they also have some on FamilySearch, MyHeritage. You know, online family trees have a way to attach memories or attach stories to your family tree. So you can see a screenshot of my great-grandmother Mildred Lawrence, and I've attached a memory for her where I've written a story about her and attached it there. So that is one option. And you can also write up your story into an article, and then you can share that in a lot of different places. So I have created a website and a blog for my family history, and I share blog posts there about all different parts of my family. I also, you know, reformat those and kind of rewrite them to send to the Genealogical Society as a written article, you know, so that is a different audience. That's why I slightly rewrite it. You can also package them together into a newsletter that you send out to your family, you know, send it out in paper form or send it out via email. So think of ways that you can write up this into a short article or blog post and then share it with whoever you want to share it with, right? There's all kinds of options for this. And so once you've gotten several articles, you know, many blog posts, things like that, if you wanted to take the jump, you can put them together, assemble them into like a full-length book, or maybe if you're writing about your own memories, a full-length memoir. There's all kinds of resources out there for publishing your own book. You can go self-publish, print on demand, publisher, you know, traditional publisher route. So there's a lot that goes into this, so don't be intimidated by it. Just do a little bit at a time. If you have a lot of stories to tell, but you're adding a little more fiction in, there is something called genealogical fiction. So you can fictionalize your family stories and you know, publish that as fiction. And if you want to have a book, but all of that part is a little bit intimidating, there are services out there like Storyworth. So what Storyworth does is they will send you a prompt every week, I believe, and it'll send you a question, you write something up and you send it back, and at the end of a full year, then they assemble all of those into a published book for you. So there are services out there that do that kind of thing. So again, there's a lot that could go into writing your family history, but there are a lot of resources out there. So check out some of the books that I've recommended in your handout and try to see if your local library has those books. Trying to get to my next slide. Okay, there we go. All right, so the next topic is stories with photos and video. So if you're doing something like blog posts, you're probably going to be including photos in with those. You know, an article for a genealogical society is going to have a few photos with it, but these projects have the photos or videos as the main focus of your project. So one idea is to have a shadow box of something that you want to share a story with and have it in your home and use it as an opportunity, as a starting point for sharing stories about the thing. So this one is kind of paired with sharing your stories out loud. So I have an example here of a recipe card with the photo of a woman and her tea towel and a few of her little tools for the kitchen, her spoon and a little whisk. And then when family comes over, you can point to that and say, oh yeah, we're making, your grandma's cookies. So here's a picture of her, and tell a little story about her, and use it as an opportunity to share a story, like use it as a prompt to share a story. You can make stories using a visual timeline. So there are websites out there, or you can make this yourself. Some examples are like history lines or tree lines. So you make a timeline, and you have different points along the timeline, and share the story chronologically along that timeline. And you can add photos and other things in there to share the story. If your audience is on the younger side, what I have seen other people do is make a coloring book or a storybook. So I have a couple examples of something that someone else had done, and they made coloring books with a story about specific ancestors, and they made this for a family reunion where a lot of kids were going to be there. So it is one way to get children involved in the family history, even if they aren't ready for a long story. And there is a website called History Pin, which I find really interesting. This is a website where you can share photos and stories based on a community. So you go to the community where your family was from, and you can put a little pin, maybe where their house was, or something like that, and share a story or a photo that way. And that helps you connect with other people whose family, or maybe they are from that specific community. All right, and a few more. So another great way to share family photos and those kinds of things are a scrapbook or a photo book. You can make this either, by hand or on the computer, and share short little stories next to the photos as you're putting this together. If you're wanting to make this online, there's all kinds of places that do photo books now. Shutterfly, Mixbook, Peekaboo, I think Walgreens and CVS, other photo printing places also, you can put these together. So there's a lot of opportunities out there to put this together. Another great thing that those companies also do is they do things like calendars and other photo gifts. So if you don't want to have a book, calendar is always on the wall throughout the year. And so you can be looking at the family pictures and reading the family stories throughout the whole year. A variation of this is a family cookbook, which I have a picture of mine on the screen, and I have one right here. So I'm very excited that I just this month finished the family cookbook. And with these kinds of things, you will pair your family's recipes with some photos and with the stories that go along with those recipes. So for mine, I'll tell about the origin of the dish, who it came from, and then a little very short story about that person who it came from. So this is a really great way for my family to connect to our family history, because we still eat all of these things at family dinners and family holidays. So it's a really great way to learn about the history behind the things that we still do every year. And another way is to make a family history video. And unfortunately, the video that I had prepared is not showing up on the screen. But you can create a family video. So if you had recorded yourself just sharing a story, you can pair that audio with some pictures and things and put it together into a video that you can share on YouTube or other social media, or maybe burn it on a DVD and send it out to your family. So there's all kind of opportunities to share the video, and it's a really great supplement to supplement, your audio with pictures, or maybe you have some short videos that don't have any sound. You can pair that with your audio and put that together for your family. All right. And finally, some ideas for using social media. If you use social media, if you already have an account, you can start sharing little stories and pictures and things on your social media account. And maybe your family will see it, or maybe friends that you are connected with will be interested in it. I already do this like on my Instagram account and on Facebook and other things that I'm on. I'll just put out a picture and say, this is my grandma and I'm remembering her on International Women's Day and she was in the Navy. And I can add more details in the comments if I don't want to put it all in the caption. Another thing that you can do that's related is a virtual family reunion. So if you're already connected with some of your family and you can't all get together for a in-person family reunion, you can host a virtual family reunion over Zoom or something similar and share family stories that way out loud and just get together and swap family stories. There are Facebook groups out there where you can share stories. You know, you can seek out any of the thousands of genealogy groups that are out there and look for ones where people are sharing stories, and maybe there's going to be other genealogists who are interested in your family story as well. One of the things that I've done is created a private group just for one branch of my family, and I will connect with and invite, you know, my mom's cousins and their kids and, you know, my extended family on that side of the family. And then in the Facebook group, I'll share pictures that they might be interested, or for Father's Day, I'll say, oh, you know, Father's Day is coming up. Share a really quick story about something that you love about your father. And so we're all collaboratively sharing short stories together. And I'm also getting stories that I write out to them. So if I write a blog post about this side of the family, I'm going to be sharing it in the group. And then so other people will be able to read it because they aren't subscribers to my blog, but they are part of the Facebook group, and they should be able to see those stories. And as I mentioned before, you can attach stories to online family trees if you have one. One thing that you can do to connect your family tree with social media, if you wanted to do that, is you can often package the stories that you have or photos that you have on the online family trees and share them to social media. Like I think Ancestry has a way to like create a Facebook story and share it to Facebook. So if you're interested in that, that is another way to get your story out and get your photos out and share them with family members who might not be on Ancestry, but might be on Facebook and might see it there. And with social media, I do use this in conjunction with other things. So making a video or writing or recording an oral recording or something like that. Then I will use social media in order to get it to my family members or get it to my intended audience so that they see it. All right. And now I just want to touch upon preserving your family stories, because you don't want to put in all of this work into making the stories and recording them, and then they somehow get lost. You know, they aren't preserved. So the idea that I have in mind, that I'm always keeping in mind for my own things, is LOCKS. So this stands for lots of copies, keeps stuff safe. And you may have heard of this before. So, you know, if you just think about, oh, what if you only have a copy of a story on your computer and your computer dies, or there's a fire in your house, or maybe it's only on Facebook, but your Facebook gets hacked, you know, or you have it on your website, but you know, something happens and you don't pay for the website and it goes down, you know, so you want to always make sure that there's multiple copies of stuff and stored in other places so that if something happens to one thing, it doesn't entirely get lost. Okay, so if you have the originals, keep the original stuff safe. If you're doing something like a shadow box or a scrapbook, make a copy of the original photo or original letter or whatever it is. Keep the original safe and use a really good copy of it in your project. If it's, you know, an original recording that you do, you know, keep that in a place where you know it is, and so it doesn't get like lost on your phone or something like that. If you have copies of stuff on the internet, download a copy for yourself. We always think of the internet as, oh, if it goes on the internet, it's there forever. Well, not necessarily. We want to keep a copy for ourselves. So if you put up a blog post, you're going to want to copy that either as a PDF or maybe copy it onto a Microsoft Word or something like that. Get it off the internet and save a copy of that text and those photos for yourself. If it's stories that are shared in a Facebook group, could be as simple as taking a screenshot of the conversation and saving a copy for yourself. And then back up your digital files. So by now we've probably all encountered a computer crashing or a hard drive that we have gets lost or damaged, or anything could happen to the files that we have stored. So make a backup of it. If you have it on your computer, make a backup onto an external hard drive, or have a backup copy in the cloud, or any kind of backup copy. Just do it. Make a backup copy for yourself. It's always better to have extra copies than to lose all your files. If you're doing something that is print, make extra copies of your project. So for example, my cookbook, there is more than one copy of this. So if something happens to my one copy, my family members each have a copy. So there's extra copies out there. And maybe I'll print one extra copy of this in case something happens to one of them, and then I have an extra copy to give them, right? So you don't want to have just one copy and that's it, because what if something happens to it? And lastly, think long-term. So there's different things that can go into this, but what I mean here is if you have stories and you want to make sure that people will be able to find them in the future, consider donating that extra copy to a local library or an archives or historical society or genealogical society, or even extended family like second cousins, third cousins. Give extra copies so that they are out there, so future generations will be more likely to be able to find them. So, if it's not your own grandchild that is looking for stories about the ancestors, like where are they going to be looking? Well, maybe they'll be looking at the library. So maybe I should be giving a copy of this long story that I wrote about our family to the library. So consider long-term where these stories are going to end up and try to make a plan for that. All right. And one small thing about encouraging others to share their story, because we are probably not the only ones in our family who know family stories. And there may be people in our family that just say, well, no one's interested in that old stuff. No one wants to hear these things. No one cares about it. So the first tip is to show interest in their story. Okay, maybe they think no one is interested, and maybe it's just enough to say, I am really interested, and it's really important to me to know what your story is, or what the story of your grandparents is. Maybe remind them of the 200-year present, that they are the bridge, from their beloved grandparents to the future, that they need to be the bridge and share their story. Ask open-ended questions. So this goes into oral interview skills. Ask things like, what's your favorite family story? Or when you're sitting around the table, where did this dish come from? Oh, it came from Aunt Sally. What do you remember about Aunt Sally? So ask questions like that to get the conversation going. Keep the conversation casual. For some people, a formal oral history interview or something like that, or a formal interview is very intimidating and they can't remember things on the spot. But if it's just a casual conversation where you're reminiscing about how things used to be, it's a little more easier to talk about certain things. Some people need something to spark a conversation or spark a certain memory. So using things like photos or talking about a specific heirloom or a dish or something can help get the conversation going. Involve them in your research. So maybe you come across an interesting family story and you go to them and you say, well, did you know that great grandpa did this and this and this? And maybe they will remember, oh yeah, I do remember that. I had completely forgotten, and maybe they can fill in a few details, or maybe they didn't know and it is interesting to them. And lastly, be respectful. Some topics or some relationships might be painful for certain family members to talk about. So if someone is hesitant or outright refuses to discuss specifics about something, move on to a different topic and maybe get that information from someone else. Because some topics may be hurtful and painful and they're not ready to talk about. So be respectful for that. All right, so my final thoughts and tips for you for getting started with this. The first one I've mentioned before, but I'm going to mention it again. Don't wait. Today, when you are sitting around the dinner table, or today, you can find a journal and start jotting down some of these memories. Don't wait for the future. There's always going to be some excuse to make you put it off. You say, oh, I'll wait till I'm retired. I'll wait till the winter time when I have more time. Or, you always think you'll do it later and you probably won't. So just start now. And once you get going, it'll be a lot easier to just do a little bit on a consistent basis. And along those same lines, do a little bit at a time. You don't have to write that 400-page book tomorrow, right? You don't have to do it all at once. Do a little bit at a time. So when I was getting started, I wanted to write all the stories and do all these things, and I was pretty ambitious. I wanted to have blog posts all the time, and it just wasn't realistic. I was working full-time, and I still am working full-time, and it's just not realistic to do that much in that short amount of time. But I can write one blog post or one article a month, and that is good for me. I'll do a little bit at a time. So over the years, I end up with a lot of stories that I've recorded. It doesn't have to be perfect. So with a lot of things, done is better than perfect. You're not the next William Shakespeare, and you're not going to have this brilliantly written memoir, things like that. But having something is valuable, so don't shoot for perfection. I know it's really, really hard because I'm a perfectionist and I want it to be perfect, but it doesn't have to be. Your family is going to appreciate it, or someone's going to appreciate that story, even if it's not perfect. I mentioned before, be creative, pick something that is going to work to your strengths. Recording myself and saying things out loud is not my strength, and I hate to hear my own voice. So doing something like a podcast is not something that I'm going to be comfortable with, but I am more comfortable with writing. So I've been doing a lot of writing projects and writing different places. So think creatively and you do something that is going to work for you and get you excited. This is not supposed to be homework. This is supposed to be something that you are interested in. Use your own voice. So you don't need to, recreate the story word for word and tell it exactly how your grandpa told you. It would be lovely if we could recreate that, but use your own authentic voice. It is going to be easier for you to tell the story and easier to listen to the story if it's in your own voice. And it doesn't need to be super formal either. So learn from great storytellers. So earlier I had mentioned going to storytelling events, which are really fun to go to in general, but you could seek out storytellers online, like videos of storytellers telling stories about their family history, or you can read really great stories, really great memoirs, and pay attention to the kinds of details that they use, how they tell the story, because maybe you'll be able to pick up some tips from them or learn from that kind of style. You don't want to recreate their style because you want to use your own voice, but you can say, oh, they put in details about what the kitchen sink was like, if you didn't have running water in your house, how did you get water and wash your hands and do those kinds of things? I didn't think about including those details, but it's really interesting to think about. So pay attention to what they do and see if there's anything you can pick up. And finally, as a librarian, I encourage you to get help from the library and also genealogical or historical societies. So libraries have really great books and writing resources. They have books about all kinds of topics, including social history, tips about writing, storytelling, all those kinds of things. They might have writing groups or storytelling events, like I mentioned before, to help you be a better storyteller, a better writer. They might have classes or other resources for all kinds of things. So my library, and I believe also Allen County Public Library, has something called Udemy, where there's classes for learning all kinds of things like writing skills, Microsoft Word, blogging, storytelling. So there could be resources at your library that can help you with any kind of project that you'd like to do. So reach out to your library and see what kinds of things they have. All right. And I think that is all for me. If you have questions after we leave today and you'd like to contact me, my email is in the handout, but is also here on the screen. I also on the handout put a link to my blog, and my blog is pretty much just family stories and personal stories, and you can see it as one example of a blog where you're sharing stories and what kinds of things I share in there. So if you're interested, you can go and check it out. So thank you so much for coming today and listening to me, and I think I'm ready for some questions.
Yes, thank you very much for presenting and for sharing all of those great tips and resources. We do have some questions for you. So the first one is, someone has compiled their stories in a book format, and they're wondering about how they might find a publisher to see if it can be published, or what the best way is maybe to navigate that.
So if it's like a genealogical stories, I know there are genealogical publishers out there. Off the top of my head, I'm blanking on some of the names of those publishers, but there are specific small presses out there that publish, genealogical type things. So I would try to seek those out. I'm sure I will remember it as soon as we leave today. So if that person wants to send me an email, I can look that up for them.
Thank you. And for your cookbook, how did you go about self-publishing?
So for this cookbook in particular, I used a website called Blurb, and there's various ways that you can publish through Blurb. If you have something like a PDF that you can just upload and print it like that, so you could type it up in Microsoft Word or whatever you'd like and save it as a PDF, upload it and print it. They also have a software that you can download to design your book. They also have a plugin, I believe, with Adobe InDesign. So they have a lot of different tools depending on what how you're comfortable putting it together. If you just want to use Microsoft Word because you know Microsoft Word, they have a way to publish it that way. I used their simple design software. It was called Bookwrite, and I used that to put this together, and it was fairly simple. There was a little bit of learning curve right at the beginning, but once I got the hang of the templates down and plugged in all my things, then I was able to put it together. And they did a pretty nice job. I was very pleased with how it turned out, how it looked. It's pretty good binding. All the pictures are pretty clear and those kinds of things. So that's one that I use. But I know there's a lot of similar self-publishing sites out there like Blurb that you can do something similar. Either upload a PDF or design it yourself and then upload it and publish it that way.
Sounds good. Thank you. So our next question is, this person wants to preserve old family photos and information, and they want to share that with other family members, but also thinking of that as personal information and maybe uncomfortable with it being reproduced by others and distributed. So wondering about your thoughts on that and how to go about sharing but retaining that privacy. So
Yes, yes, and that's something I forgot to mention that I was going to, that it is very important to keep the privacy of living people in mind. So if you're going to be doing something like a public blog like mine, you don't want the information of living people up on there. So you're only going to want to be talking about people who have passed away and their stories. So it is perfectly reasonable to keep that in mind. So if you do want to share, you know, information with family members and you don't want all of that information out to the general public, there are ways to do that. So for example, if you want to set up a blog or a website, but you don't want it open to the public for everyone, there is a way to have like a login page where all the stories, all the photos, all the information is behind a password. So you give the password to your family members that you want them to access it, and then they can get into the website that way, but not everyone can get in. Or, you know, for example, if you have stuff on your online family tree, you can make your online family tree so it's not public and only give access to the people you want. Or for instance, this family cookbook has a lot of information about living people and it's not for the general public. So I'm only going to give copies to the people that I want to have it. The same with some other family narratives like genealogy things that I wrote up. You know, I only sent copies that included living people. I only sent them via email. So I was sending things out via email and I was not publishing that online. So there are ways to do it, and it all depends on what you're comfortable with. But a lot of the things I was talking about, you can keep those things private and just send it out to the people that you want.
So it looks like we have one more question. So this person's wondering, which software or platform do you use to create your family history website? So I think they're wondering about your blog and what you used for that.
So when I set it up, I chose a website called WordPress, and that's what I use to put it together. There's other ones out there that are a little more not as involved with like designing and coding and things like that. One is called Blogger, I believe, and there are other ones out there now. And they're real nice. You have templates, so you just pick a template and choose a color and put your information in. But I use WordPress.
Okay. Good deal. Thank you. So I think that'll finish us up for today. I did want to mention, if anyone would like a copy of the chat for today's presentation, please send us an email to genealogy@acpl.info, and I'll stick that in the chat, and we'll send you that. And if you have questions following today's program, please feel free to send us an email as well. So thank you again for presenting. We really appreciate your time and all of the great resources that you shared. So thank you, and I hope everybody has a good day.
Yeah, thank you.